So in regards to how a braking system works, you apply pressure to the foot pedal. That pressure is then converted into greater pressure through the power booster, which is down there where that little barcode is. It's a large cylinder. That increased pressure is fed through the high pressure lines that run through over to some modules and junctions here in the engine bay. And then those pressure lines are then fed to the four corners of the car, to each wheel where the calipers are. When you come down to the calipers here, you can see that this right here is the high pressure line that I was talking about. As the fluid is pushed through there, it comes down into the back of the caliper here. Whenever the brake pedal is pressed, it forces a piston in here. You can kind of see the boot right in there. Forces that piston out, which compresses the pads on either side of the rotor, which then stops the rotor from turning. Talking about steering and suspension, there's multiple components that go into it and different things that you can adjust. So some of the components that we have here, so if you look right here, you've got your tie rod, which connects to your steering rack. You have your strut, which contains your spring and your strut, which gives you your ride comfortability and your ability to go over bumps and stuff like that. You have your upper and lower control arms. You have your sway bar right here with your sway bar end links right there. And on this side you can see the other part of the lower control arm. This is a CV axle transaxle setup. So you have your transmission right here. It is a front wheel drive car. You've got one side is a shorter CV axle, whereas the other side is a longer one. A couple of things that you can adjust on the car. If you can kind of see it, you've got caster, which is going to be your vertical angle in relation to where the wheel sits in the wheel well. And then you have camber, which determines the angle of the wheel from top to bottom, how much it sits in or out, negative camber or positive camber. And then you have toe, which determines how the wheel, I guess if you're looking at the wheel like this, how it naturally sits, whether the toe out or toe in. We have an automatic transmission. You can see that we have a torque converter here with the fans and the vanes inside. Normally on the front here you'll have a flex plate that is bolted directly to the motor. When this spins, the flex plate spins the outside as a single unit. The inside, this, and then the fans as well, they spin on their opposite direction based on how the fluid is thrown around inside. Think of it as two fans facing each other. If one fan is off and one fan is turning and blowing air at the other one, that other fan will spin the opposite direction. It creates a vortex, which then helps turn the rest of the shaft that's inside the automatic transmission. All of this here is you have a bunch of clutch discs as well as gears in here. And when it turns, it just turns all of the pieces of the automatic transmission. To know how to shift, a lot of them have valve bodies and stuff that the fluid flows through, which determines when it shifts. A lot of the newer transmissions have electronic shifting capabilities, where based on the speed of the engine and the rotation, like the speed of the car and the RPMs of the engine, determines on the shift points of the transmission. It's to a manual transmission. The housing is somewhat similar to an automatic transmission. However, the main components that you have is you're going to have your flywheel, which is this right here. You're going to have your clutch disc, which is this right here. And then you're going to have your flex plate, which is this right here. Attached to your flex plate, you'll have your throwout bearing. That will be connected to your clutch fork, and whenever you depress and press the clutch, it moves the flex plate in and out, which provides pressure from the clutch disc to the flywheel. When there is no pressure being applied to the clutch fork itself, the pressure plate is pushing the clutch disc onto the flywheel, which is causing the motor and the transmission to turn together. When you press in the clutch, it presses on the clutch fork, which then depresses the pressure plate, removing the clutch disc from the flywheel so that the engine and the transmission can spin separately. So a brief overview of the heating and AC. Your heat in your car, it runs off of the heat from the radiator and the engine. So what happens is you have your coolant that runs through your radiator, which runs through the engine, through the sleeves and channels in the engine block. On the back side, you're going to have two hoses right there that run to your heater core. They go through the firewall, and inside the heater core is basically like another radiator. It's got a bunch of fins on it and a fan behind it. That warm or hot coolant that runs through it will sit there and run through the fins, and the fan blows that hot air into the cabin. Now it's very similar when you're talking about AC as well. However, AC doesn't run through the engine. AC has its own compressor, which is right down there. So you have the AC compressor with the high pressure line. It uses R134, basically Freon. You have your compressor, your condenser, which sits in front of the radiator. And that fluid is then compressed. It's sent through the high pressure lines and into the cabin, where another fan blows across that unit and causes the AC to be blown into the car. You're not actually breathing in the R134, it's just cooling the pipes, and then the air is blowing across it, similar to how a swamp cooler works. When it comes to the starter, when you turn the key, it would be right here. Boom. Alright, on this side, boom. The starter kicks over when it gets the signal from the ignition. It's always got a constant power supply from the battery. It's got a hot wire that runs from the battery to the starter, so there's always power supplied to it. However, the signal wire is what causes the solenoid to kick over, pushes out the starter gear, which then starts turning and makes a connection with the engine itself. Not the engine itself, but like, say for instance, a manual car. It has the flywheel. The starter makes connection with the flywheel, which then turns the motor over. During that time, you have a bunch of other signals that are happening from the ECU, which is normally inside the car. You do have a main fuse box also that makes sure that all of the components are started and running. The ECU inside the car then gets everything up and running when it comes to timing with the spark plugs, the fuel injectors, airflow, and all at once you get all of your strokes going in the motor, your 4 strokes. Compression happens, ignition happens, and the motor turns over, and then it becomes self-sustained without the use of the starter. It all becomes engine management through the computer at that point. As far as running, you have your alternator here. It's belt driven. Now what happens is you have the magnets inside that run through the copper wires, the windings on the outside. Based on how much signal is provided to it, it's called the feed, increases the magnetic field, which determines the output of the DC energy or the DC electricity coming out of the alternator. However, there are diodes that convert that DC into AC current that the car can then use. Systems you have, the components. So you're going to have you can either have a overhead cam, which this cutaway motor happens to be. So you have your camshafts up top here that touch your valve springs. You have your pistons, your rods, the crankshaft that the rods are connected to. Over here, exhaust manifold, intake manifold. You've got they're called coil-on plugs when they're like this. Sometimes you'll have a coil pack where it'll be, if it's like a 4-cylinder motor, you'll have 2 coil packs. Each one feeds 2 spark plugs. Underneath this is your spark plugs. The wires that connect to this would be your engine harness that runs to the ECU that controls the timing. On the front here, you have your alternator. You have your crank pulley. You have your idler pulley. You've got your camshaft gears. More idler pulleys here. Right here, this would be your water pump. As you can see on the inside, you have the impeller. It's not attached to this, but normally off to this side or even down on the bottom side over here, you would have your A.S.E compressor, which is also pulley driven. You have your oil filter. On the bottom, you have your oil pan.